Welcome to Transformation 2.0, the podcast for change leaders. My name is Chamara, and in each episode, we bring you real conversations with executives, innovators, and experts who are shaping the future of business. Whether you are leading a team, scaling a company, or navigating the challenges of transformation, this podcast will provide you with insights, strategies, and inspiration to drive meaningful change. Join us as we explore what it takes to lead, adapt, and thrive in an ever-evolving world. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Transformation 2.0. Today we are speaking to Uthpala Senarathne Tennakoon, Associate Professor of Human Resources Management at Bisset School of Business at Mount Royal University. Welcome to the show, Uthpala. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, Chamara. As you mentioned, I currently work at Mount Royal University as an associate professor in HR. My background into HR is actually I have a PhD in HR and organizational dynamics from University of Calgary. But prior to that, it's a slightly different background from HR. So I started my undergrads in engineering, electronics and telecommunication from Sri Lanka. And then a little bit of a deviation in my MBA to technology management. That's my MBA topic area. So that led me to shift gears and move into HR so that's where the PhD comes into HR and the teaching part. In addition to that, I'm also a qualified management accountant in SEMA. So that kind of has me different footholds in engineering, HR, finance, and management accounting. So that's kind of my background.
Thank you for that. Wow, that's a lot of different areas that you cover. So you've got a finance background, you've got a business and HR background, and then you've got an engineering background. So you're definitely very much a multidisciplinary practitioner and obviously an educator as well. So it's great to have you on the podcast. And today the topic that I want to go through with you is the right to disconnect. How do we balance the digital innovation with employee well-being? And I know this is quite a pertinent topic because there are a lot of people that I've spoken to that see, yes, technology is helping them, but it's also taking a lot of attention away from the things that they need to do in life. And obviously, we are in what everyone calls the attention economy, right? So, big tech is very much about how do we get people's attention onto their apps, and obviously how do they monetize that as their way of driving value into their organization. But at the same time, while some of them are doing the right things, not everyone is doing the same following the same guidelines, right? So this topic of being able to manage the well-being of everyone in society, not just adults but also kids. I think that's where I think this really hits the rubber really hits the road for both of us. We both have little kids, and we're really worried about how kids get influenced. But I think, like, from a workplace perspective, just to address the topic of this podcast, which is Transformation 2.0 for change leaders, with around innovation and transformation, as well as what the work you do around HR and organizational dynamics. This aspect of right to disconnect, which is quite relevant in the Australian context today, because in Australia we had the right to disconnect policy that passed through the parliament last year in February, and it came into effect for non-small businesses in August last year. And obviously it's coming into effect for small businesses in Australia in August this year. So this topic is quite relevant today. And I think, that this is why I wanted to actually go through with you and maybe get your perspective on some of the things that we're discussing today. So thank you very much again for coming on this episode today. I really look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Chamara, for having me.
And obviously the first topic that I wanted to address is understanding what is the right to disconnect. So if you really look at it more from a what does the new legislation talk about in terms of this employees' right to disconnect, and also what are the implications, A, for the organization, and then B, for the individuals themselves, and then obviously, like, how do we balance it in the context of the rapidly evolving organizations that are going through digital innovation and digital transformation, which is kind of making people want to be more engaged with the organizations. And I think, like, it's a very delicate balance. And I think, like, understanding what the right to disconnect is, and how it actually helps both the individual as well as in organization in a balanced manner is probably the tricky bit that we need to navigate, right? So I'd love to really hear your thoughts around it.
So the right to disconnect legislation, the general idea is to empower employees to disengage from work-related communication outside the regular working hours. So the type of legislation which is happening across the world at this point, many countries have implemented this. France pioneered this in 2017, and there are quite a lot of countries in the EU and South America, and I guess now in Australia, and even Canada is joining the bandwagon. So this legislation gives the employees to say no to communication from work, especially after hours or beyond the paid work hours. So that's a right they get, which is an important thing, because usually it's harder to say no when the employer calls you or asks you to do something. But then when the legislation says, well, you have the right, that is really actually something important. Uh, so the idea behind the legislation is usually to help employees balance their work and non-work lives, because sometimes work tend to follow you all the way, all the time. And that is, you talked about how do we balance this needs of the organization and needs of the employees, because sometimes one thing we tend to forget is when you are overworked or when you are always connected, it is not always a good thing from an organization's point of view as well, because there is productivity issues, there is burnout issues, which is becoming a huge concern for many organizations. So so the idea behind right to disconnect is to provide this opportunity for employees to disengage from work and recharge and rejuvenate. But also it's not always, it's not something that is detrimental to the organization. There are lots of benefits they can also get from that.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think, like, when you mentioned about, this, the constant connectivity that we seem to have, and I can definitely relate to that. Like when I used to work in the corporate world, I used to feel like, I was actually tethered to the work because of the mobile that you carry. And so whenever there was holidays, I would actually pick like a location that didn't have mobile signal. So A, so people can't call me, and then B, yeah, like whenever there is a message, there's nothing like pinging in my phone to say, you got an email or you got a notification, right? And I think like people are actually getting a little bit smart about this, being able to turn off notifications and on a sort of more individual app. And I guess maybe like the mobile software is actually becoming smarter as well in terms of giving us that ability to turn off notifications for certain apps and certain individuals, depending on how we want to control our lives nowadays, right? But I think, like, to me, what I want to go back into is, I think like when we go talk about digital innovation and organization culture, and I think like, there's an expectation in most large organizations that this kind of like standardized approach that we say is what's applicable to every individual, right? And they tend to measure productivity for innovation, transformation, and more sort of operational work based on that same metric. And I think, like, to me, I think that's the aspect that I feel like maybe we can discuss a bit more about, because if you really look at the sort of the more day-to-day operational work, and I think that's where like that standardized approach quite works. But when it comes to driving in more innovation or driving more sort of transformational outcomes and transformational programs of work or projects, right? And I think the level of work is a little different. And I think like it's also largely the kind of people that kind of gravitates towards that kind of work. So if you really look at that, people who are really a lot more comfortable about the operational sort of like, more predictable operational nature of work, they are the kind of people who really have that dislike towards more sort of like, the regular distractions. But like people who are more sort of that innovation or transformation aspect, they are people that have developed this skill to be able to kind of like, maintain the work-life balance in a little bit more, I guess, what's the way I'm looking? It's more probably more sort of balanced way, if I can say that. So they kind of know, like there are times where you need to have that flexibility to actually take your little one to see the doctor, or to be able to do something around the house because there's no one else helping with that. But then, like, when there's extra work to be done, they actually know, oh yeah, this is something that you need to get it done because you have a commitment to the workplace that you're working with. And I think, like, this is where kind of like that maturity of individuals really starts to shine as well, right? So some people really think of the work being intruding into that time that they are spending, whether it's 9 to 5 or whether what that fixed time, right? And I think, like, this is where we really start to see the difference of people who are driving different types of work have sort of different ways that they need to be supported, right? And I think the way the legislation's kind of written is kind of like, this is the standard we are applying to everyone. And I think that to me actually has a little bit of I guess a balancing act that most organizations will struggle to navigate, because now this is the law. They're kind of always going to be on the second guessing, right? They're going to be on the back foot, right? But at the same time, in terms of how they want to drive the work that's needed for the organizations, they also need to understand that people that can maintain that balance and be able to engage them, right? And I think I'd really love to hear your thoughts around, in terms of, obviously from your HR background, how you think about that more from an HR policy perspective, and as well as obviously, like, based on how the legislation is evolving, how do we maintain that balance between giving the people the freedom and flexibility and the right to disconnect, but at the same time, getting things done when things have to be done, right? And this is the hardest thing that we need to balance.
So most legislation with regards to right to disconnect actually are not super prescriptive. In many situations they actually have the legislation says the organizations need to implement policies, or they need to have some kind of a policy or a practice that addresses right to disconnect. So in many situations the legislation gives the flexibility to the organizations to come up with a practice or a policy that addresses the right to disconnect. But the interesting part is in how does the organization use that to come up with a actionable plan that is accepted to them as well as the employees, and of course there are other stakeholders like their customers. So in order to do that, of course, organizations first probably need to understand what exactly is the demand or the needs from in terms of supporting their client base or their customer base, and then have honest conversations with their employees about, okay, what does this mean to you? So as you pointed out, work-life balance is a very individual thing. Like, for example, what is work-life balance to me may not necessarily mean the same thing to you. Some people might want to have it super segmented, as we call it. I don't want any of my work coming into my personal life. But then some are very much what we call integrators, who has everything on their phone or computer, and they shift from one thing to the other, whether it's could be work related or life related, now home related, but they manage both of those. And also when it comes to the legislation, especially the right to disconnect, when I say it, if it is super prescriptive, it actually creates some challenges. For example, if it says, even from an organization's point of view, if the organization says, okay, we are shutting down all our servers at 7 o'clock in the night, nobody can send an email, it may not necessarily be the best mode of action, because sometimes the organization still have to continue. But also individuals might like the flexibility to, as you said, take your kid to kids play and then come home and do the work, right? So that gives them the flexibility to balance their work and life. So if you have like a one platform that fits everybody, it may not necessarily work across the board. And also there are certain types of jobs where you might need people to be available for shift work, because that is the nature of the business. And And some people, as you said, may like the idea of being able to continuously churn out work and some people like myself, who's like a night owl, I tend to be more productive during the times when other people sleep sometimes. So then that if my organization is not allowing me to work during that time, whether it's a lack of serve access or something like that, that creates problems. So then there is this individualistic element that comes into play when you say right to disconnect is there, but how does that apply across the board? But on the flip side, it is really, really important to understand that employees do need to disconnect, because I do a lot of research on work-life balance, and one of my research projects examined constant connectivity to work through technological devices. How does that impact your work-life balance? So in the short run, you might say, oh, yeah, I can survive. But if you continuously connected to work all the time, it actually creates a situation where you can, because you only have limited amount of time, right? 24 hours a day for your work situations and personal situations. So when you take a lot of time, whether it's like answering an email or sending a text or doing whatever it is from let's say family time, it can create a conflict. But also, because you are always connected to the work, you don't have the chance to disconnect from work and recharge or rejuvenate. So we call that the enrichment part. So for example, you can't have a laugh with your family or a beer with your friends and enjoy that relaxation. So then you're always on work. So that kind of creates a downward spiral of you could losing the work-life balance situation. So because of that, it is also very, very important that people can have that disconnection from work. So that is the intention of the right to disconnect legislation, so that there is intentionality from the organizations to provide that disconnection to people, so that they can, without fear of, for example, losing their job, say, well, I have the right to say no. I can check this email tomorrow morning. I don't have to respond to it right away, and I will not lose my job because I didn't do that. So that's the importance of this right. And when it comes to organizations, as I said, it is going to be a lot of conversational elements built into it, because you have to figure out what is the requirements of your organization, what are the requirements of your employees, and how do you manage this right to disconnect. So rather than having a super prescribed approach, maybe you can have, as you said, smaller unit level discussions. There should be a broader overall policy umbrella, but then within the specific units, even within an organization, sometimes if you are an operational, like a plant manager, you need people to, if it's a plant that runs 24/7, yeah, you need to have people who on call, for example. Yeah. But if you are a surgeon, you might need to be on call because that's a life or death situation, but yeah, it's not applicable for everybody, right? Yeah, there absolutely are certain things that the world is not going to end tomorrow because you don't respond to the email right now. So understanding what the job demands are and understanding what your customer requirements are is important. And then, of course, once you come up with those policies, it's really important to have clear policies and communicate and educate not only the employees, but then their supervisors, their managers, because you can have all the written rules, but it gets implemented at the individual level. Yeah. So you really need to have those conversations. Education, training part becomes important.
Now, thank you for highlighting. And I think, what you mentioned about just because you receive an email, you don't need to answer that. That really resonates. Someone I used to work with used to have this tagline at the bottom of their signature. They used to say, just because I send this email now, that doesn't mean I expect a response straight away. I expect you to respond at a time that is convenient to you, that works best for your way of working. Nothing like, being able to have that kind of messaging back then. That was about 5 years ago. I thought that was really forward thinking of them to have that. Nothing, nothing like, right. As you rightfully said, it's that, the fact that the employers actually have that ability to say, no, sorry, I can't do this now, but then not be penalized for it. And I think that's the sort of the crux of it, right? Because at the end of the day, like, just because somebody said no, that doesn't mean they lack commitment, or they're not doing their job. It's just that, they need that break. And I think when you talked about being able to disconnect from work and be able to recoup and rejuvenate, that definitely resonated with me. And I think I mentioned earlier about going camping where there's no network signal. That was my reason behind that. And I think, talking about being able to take your kids to activities, I can definitely resonate with that as well. I take my son through most of his extracurricular activities, and I've actually learned to work in the car, because that's kind of like what I have to do. I drive him to his sports, and while he's playing, I work in the car, and you kind of get adapted to it. And I think, like, for me, like, being able to get that done is necessary, because that's what I need to do. And I think for some people it's the same. And I think, you talked about being a night owl. I can definitely relate to that. I was up until quite late last night myself. And being able to really think about things in a really, especially those things that really require a lot of cognitive depth, I tend to leave it at night, because that's the quietest time of the day. And it's a lot easier to focus at that time. And yeah, so definitely a lot of things that you said resonates. And I think, being able to implement these things in a way that actually supports not just the organization's intent, but also the employees' needs. And I think that's the bit that we really need to be balancing on. Thank you for highlighting that. And maybe just moving on to the next point that I want to address, it's probably more around the fact that obviously you come, because of the career path you've had a lot of different experiences across a few different disciplines. As we talked about earlier, you've had the exposure to the engineering discipline, obviously, through your engineering background, and obviously you studied finance, and then you moved into HR, right? So what I want to talk a little bit about is maybe get your perspective on how these different disciplines actually see right to disconnect, and I guess maybe the different views that they bring into this conversation, because I feel like this is an important element of what we need to navigate as we try to resolve this in the implementation of this act, the policy, right? And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So if you think about the right to disconnect as a legislation, once there is a legislation, then the organizations need to adopt it. So there is the HR element coming right through, because, okay, now we have a law saying we have to have a policy, so let's create the policy. So that becomes really important from an HR perspective to draft the policies, make sure it is applicable, it is relevant to the organization, and it's communicated, as I said. So there is that actionable components about getting the policy or the legislation and bringing it into the organization level, right? And in addition to that, then there is the situation of creating that culture that this is accepted. All of those fall within the HR domain. But then, of course, once you implement anything, you really need to understand, is that getting it, like, is that getting any benefits to us? So that's for example, the return on investment part, because many organizations on their own have implemented these kind of practices and policies because they actually tend to bring in benefits. Some are actually harder to measure, but you can. So the financial component, and also sometimes the language to communicate these kind of practices, the benefit of that would be to talk in the financial terms, right? So we if we implement this kind of a policy, what is the cost to us? So we probably are not being able to communicate with our employees every instant, but then how is that going to impact our customers, our projects, delivery deadlines? So that is a element that you probably need to investigate. But on the flip side, what is the productivity increase? Is there a productivity increase from our employees because they are maybe more rested and are more alert because they're not burnt out? So, and when you talk about the burnout and you talk about
The cost of
the
burnout, right? To
cost of burnout, because
cost of
there's a lot of
absenteeism.
absenteeism, even presenteeism. In addition to that, the healthcare costs, like if your organization is providing benefits, one of the biggest costs these days is actually medication related to mental health, stress, all of those, and which are very much related to overworked employees. So there is a cost associated with that. So does that help in the long run to bring that down? So when you talk about the finance engineering, then the analytics comes into play, right? How do you evaluate all of these things? And then from an engineering perspective, the systems thinking, okay, we are thinking about this as an organization, as a system, and then we have the subsystems within the organization, divisions, departments, and then how, when you implement all these, how are each of these affected and the processes affected? um, and one of the other things that I really want to think about, just about if you think about the right to disconnect element on its own, it's not only going to affect one individual. So if my organization implements right to disconnect policies, yes, as an employee, I will probably benefit depending on how I work and if it matches. But also it has a broad element too, right? If I am healthier, then it's going to affect my family, my well-being around my children. You talked about that at the beginning. And then there is a broader societal element. So some of these benefits we might not even see immediately. The societal benefits, it might take even a generation to see some of these benefits. So it's not
A
only present.
long tail of the ROI.
Yes, there is a long one too.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that perspective. Another, like what you mentioned about, being able to apply this to different areas differently. And I think that definitely resonates. That kind of relates to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the innovation work, or the transformation work, or the more operational kind of work, and I think like being able to apply different practices around these in terms of the nature of work, and saying the right to disconnect for somebody who is, in a 24/7 environment is different to somebody who is more in a office environment. So you need to be able to have that flexibility in the policy to be able to navigate that dynamic, right? And I think it's good that you highlighted that as well. And maybe
And even
just
to
sorry.
add one more point to that one, like I mentioned, right to disconnect is implemented across different countries, and Australia is now coming to with that. But again, there are additional broader societal elements like how work is viewed within that society. Sometimes even the gender differences about how society treats, like say for example, is there a difference between how men and women work, or what are the responsibilities associated with those different genders within the society? And say for example, some of the European, like the France and other European countries, they have the notion that of course the free time is protected, free time is precious and valued, and organizations respect that, compared to, for example, some of the North American or the South Asian cultures where, yeah, you are supposed to be working because that's the work, that's the culture, that's the nature of the beast here, right? So those elements bring in a slight another layer into how you implement these policies and how these are accepted from the employees themselves too.
No, that's a good point. And I think while you were talking about it, I was actually thinking about, like, you and I both come from a obviously South Asian background, and obviously we both live in Western oriented societies now. And I think, like, obviously, I'm sure you've seen the how the way, the Western oriented societies treat work life balance versus how, the culture that we grew up in treats that. And I think, like, there's a vast difference. And I think also largely, I think it's also how, I think, like in most Western oriented societies, the family extended family networks are a little different to a lot of the South Asian cultures that we grew up in, and I think that kind of plays to some place has an impact to some degree as well. And I think like the way we balance work life now is actually more because of the way we live today, right? And that could mean differently. So I think like being able to apply these policies in a different context, different regions of the world, different cultures, that's definitely something that resonates a lot. And then maybe like thinking about, I guess, the ROI element. Obviously, we spoke about the long tail of ROI, but I think also one of the things is like when you really look at that right to disconnect and giving people that ability to recoup and rejuvenate and come back fresher in the morning, especially for some people in certain roles, it could actually mean an increased productivity when they start the work on the next day, right? And another, like is there any research going on around how to actually quantify what sort of jobs that will have an impact in? And obviously the other side of that is with what's happening with AI in terms of where if we can gain efficiencies through certain things that can actually help us maintain that right to disconnect better, right? By aggregating everything that comes into our inbox overnight and giving us a brief summary in the morning, for example, right? And how do we sort of like balance navigate some of these things?
So when it comes to sorry, the question is about how do we navigate the right to disconnect situations with using the new tech? Is that, sorry?
I think there's two aspects to that question. Sorry, one is about sort of like how do we? I guess the first part is about, is there any research going on around how can we quantify the impact of improved productivity because people are actually now better rested and have more value they can deliver for the organization, right? And then the other side of that is obviously the current focus is on how do we drive productivity with AI. To me, I think like yes, there are areas where AI can help us drive that productivity, but also letting our people be more rested and be able to focus on work can actually drive a lot of deep work that can drive a lot of value in a lot of organizations, especially in certain areas of work, right? And I think a lot of those areas of work that where people's deep work can add value are things where a lot of the human capabilities are needed that I find will take AI a lot longer to catch up, right? So I think like there's a huge focus on, yes, AI will help us get the productivity gains, right? But I think like there's an element of um, something like right to disconnect can actually help us have a much better rested workforce that can do a lot of that work that we cannot automate with AI just yet, right? And I think this is why I think this is quite important, right? Because yes, AI is going to be taking away a lot of the things that we can automate, but the things that we cannot automate, we need that rested workforce to be able to focus on that so that we can drive the productivity and the productivity that AI can drive. I feel like maybe somewhat. I don't want to really put like numbers on this, but it will only take us to some degree. But I think like the work that people who can do the deep work can drive the value that it can drive into the economy can actually be a lot more significant, right? And I think a lot of that work will actually what will persevere in the long term in most economies, even though people don't really think of it that way, right? And that's kind of like what the focus of the question is.
Right. Yeah. So there have been a lot of research going on about the return on investment on employee well-being for sure, because this right to disconnect is one aspect of employee well-being, right? So it and in the fields of organizational behavior, psychology, even lots of areas, different areas, even in management sciences. There are lots of studies going on trying to understand, okay, how does the employee well-being relate to the bottom line? Yeah. Basically, that is the return on investment. Yeah. And generally speaking, the studies show that if your employees are less stressed, less burnt out, and then that tends to have better productivity because, as you said, they are more rested, they are less prone to injuries, there is less potential for accidents, less
Mistakes.
potential for errors. All of those overall tend to create a situation, broadly speaking, to have a better return on investment for whatever the organizations tend to spend or focus on employee well-being. So that's the broad general idea.
Yeah.
And I don't have top of my head specific right to disconnect studies happening on this particular area, because partly some of it is kind of new. Many organizations are coming through because the legislation is flowing through these days.
Yeah.
And one of the things that have come, even some of my work talks about the fact that there is no one pill that fits all, suits, like that will remedy all the problems, right? You really need to cater to individual
Shades of gray, right?
yes, the individual organizational needs, and also to think about the equity of it, because when you say, oh, okay, my organization is offering right to disconnect, it's almost always not applicable across the board. Not every employee in the organization can utilize this benefit at an equal level because of all the different elements within
Types
the
of work.
organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, types
Yeah.
of work.
Yeah.
So then you also have to think about the creating that equity. Do you pay more for the lack of the benefits? So some of those things have to factor into your return on investment equation, so that you keep the employees happier across the board. The second question you asked about was, well, would this give an opportunity for individuals to delve into things that are not possibly automated in a way, right? So the
Yeah, and I
deep
think
thinking
yes.
component,
Yeah.
which is kind of true, because with all the AI tools, yes, they can improve your productivity, help you to gather data, analyze the data, but sometimes you still have to have that human element to, for example, double check the accuracy. Because if I am saying something that AI has given me, I'm putting my name behind it, right? Whether you are a programmer or a doctor or a teacher or an educator, you need to be able to stand behind what you present or talk, or actually put out as the work of yourself. So that actually needs a lot of human intervention in a way. But also, as you talked about the innovation component, you talked about the digital transformation. So that requires a lot of innovative thinking. And you yourself said, like, sometimes you really need that uninterrupted time to think, uninterrupted time to deliver, delve into something deeper. So if you are connected all the time, that is not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because there will be a beep or a ping or a whatever that is going to disrupt you, and you're always buzzing with this external stimulus. So that is not going to help. So I definitely think that opportunity to disconnect will be really useful for people to come rejuvenated for the next day's work, whether it's with new ideas or very much deep thinking and refreshed, for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. Good to hear that, it resonates, and I'm glad to hear your thoughts on that. And when you're talking about, yes, that deep thinking, something that came to my mind was when I used to interview executives and get a lot of the data that I really need to analyze and get some insights. And I think, like, today it's probably a lot easier with AI. You can actually use the AI to try and analyze it and say, oh, show me commonalities across these. But then I used to do that like 10 years ago without AI. And when I used to do that without AI, I need to have to actually like do it at night, because I don't want to be disturbed when I'm trying to do that analysis. And now actually, like, obviously with AI, I can get a lot more help in order to do something like that. But even then, like, even with AI, as you said, like, if I'm analyzing some, a large volume of data and sharing that insights with someone that's gonna, put, invest their money on something, I want, and if I'm putting my name behind it, I want to make sure that it's right. And in order to do that, you need to be able to validate AI's output. And that means sometimes being able to get to that level of depth and be able to understand what it's come up with, and make the connect the dots, right? And that definitely helps, right? And I think that's where a lot of the things that cannot be automated for the time being, at least, will actually help benefit from this right to disconnect, right? Yeah. And I guess maybe just looking into the next question that I want to go into more about, the employer responsibility versus employee rights. This is kind of like managing a fine line, right? So obviously, there's going to be some people who really don't mind this, but there's going to be some people who are like going to be a little bit, I guess, a little bit strict about it, right? So what are some of the things organizations can do to prepare themselves as they navigate this?
Well, as I said, first thing organizations need to do is to understand what their situation is, and then, of course, create role specific expectations. Because once you especially with right to disconnect, as I said, you might have a broad overarching policy within the organization, but it may not necessarily be applicable across the board. So having role specific expectations which are clearly communicated. So for example, if you looking at the job description and saying, okay, even with this right to disconnect, your job requires you to be available for certain types of emergencies. So that is a clear expectation. And then, of course, are there compensation built into that? So everybody understands what is at stake, what is provided for, and that doesn't lead to any challenges later. Of course, providing for emergencies like you talked about system outages or client emergencies. So how do you cater for those things? And then, of course, sometimes you can have pre-agreed flexibility built in. So these particular days you will not have any communication, but in other days we need you to be available. So because sometimes you are working with teams across the world, across the globe, so then it's not the same time zone. So having those pre-agreed flexibilities will help manage some of those expectations. And then I talked about the cultural context, the legal mandates. So some legislation is very specific about what you can and can't do. Some are pretty broad, which is good and bad at the same time. But then how do you what jurisdiction are you operating in? So for example, in Canada, we have only one province who have legislated right to disconnect. The federal government is coming up with some of it, but it is not applicable. Federal employees are just a portion of all Canadian employees. So then understanding what is the legal nuances that are applicable to your organization. So when it comes to thinking about it in very practical sense, you need to set very clear boundaries about what the policy says, what is possible, what is not. But very importantly, leadership modeling is important. So so if I am the supervisor and if I completely ignore the right to disconnect policies and keep on sending emails at 10 o'clock in the night, well, I'm not being very considerate about the policy, but also I'm not setting a very good guideline, because whatever the policy says, sometimes people feel like, if my boss sends me an email, should I respond? Should I not respond? Right?
Yeah.
So then in that situation, if the supervisor is somebody who's like a night owl, maybe having that clause, like you said, like, this is, I'm sending this, you don't have responded right away, do it when you're at work, but this is my working time. Or you can actually use the technology to set those boundaries, right? You can have delay send, auto responses.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And even things like very specific server restrictions at specific times, which is like a hard rule, but it's a possibility, because some organizations did that too. Like, I think it was Voxagon who shut down their servers from 7 to 7 so that none of the emails got through. That's a very firm, hard way of doing things. But very importantly, from putting that HR head of mind, training and education becomes really important, because you can have all those policies, but if people are not aware of it and not following the way, it's important. And then, of course, regularly review what's happening. Is this working for us? And then adjust if needed. And one more element would be to have a mechanism to say, if you have a policy and if an employee feels like, I'm trying to follow the policy, but then I get 10 emails every night or 100 emails every night. So what's my repercussions? Or can I complain, or can I talk to somebody about it? So having those mechanisms to report, because if it is your immediate supervisor, there's no point there's nothing you can do. So is there an anonymous HR line or HR mechanism to resolve some of those disputes is important.
Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate your thoughts. And as you said, I think technology. Yes, there are some things technology can help in terms of how we implement this, and I guess maybe being able to address those disputes and how do we build the consensus around how we maintain these boundaries is also important. And I think to me also one of the things I see as this is actually one of the things that I'm writing about in the digital transformation guide. It's also about how do we look for more decentralized structures in organizations as part of technology enabling us to aggregate across multiple smaller teams using technology, right? So things like that, I think it's things that helps as well. And where I'm thinking here is more if you need a large team to be working at a certain time of the day, right? So then for example, if you had remote teams, then they need to be available at that same time as well. And obviously, if that remote team is in a different time zone, then the right to disconnect for them is actually in a different time zone. So that creates a lot of different challenges, right? So this is where things like dynamic work design and more sort of visual management techniques and tools becomes quite helpful in terms of that asynchronous work design. And this is a space that I'm actually navigating with a lot of the work we do, as well as some of the things that I'm writing about in terms of the digital transformation. Like this is how technology can actually bridge some of these gaps by making work visual, making work happen asynchronously. That way, even though people are in different time zones, or if people have different preferences to how they work and when they work, then it doesn't create that challenge and the dynamic, right? And this is actually one of the things that I'm quite passionate about, because it actually helps us implement this policy in a way that it supports the intended purpose, so that it actually gives people the ability to disconnect when they can and when they need to, but at the same time it actually reduces the impact on organizations by focusing on creating a lot more asynchronous work that can happen without people having to jump on a call and talk to each other all the time, right? So if you think about that, visual management and asynchronous work designs as a way to navigate this is an area where organizations can really benefit. I'd love to hear your thoughts as kind of like the final questions that we want to navigate today.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about those using some of those technological tools and systems to get the best of both worlds in a way, right? Because it is something what we, as you said, what we would call human-centered digital transformation, right? So you can come up with all these technological ideas, but then at the center of it is there is a person. So they have to be able to navigate the systems and deliver. And if you ignore the human in this digital transformation, sometimes you may not necessarily get to the desired end result. So the sustainable transformation, it's not just about upgrading systems, it's about like the mindset, change in the mindset, I think for and foremost. So leaders can be champions of this and then facilitate this conversation and facilitate the ideas, and also making sure the well-being of everybody involved. So I think that's where the success would come through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like you hit the nail on the head. It's about engaging people. It's about co-designing what that looks like, right? So if you actually bring the people into the conversation and design what the work looks like for them based on their individual needs, then you can really create that bespoke work environment that's suited for the people that are engaging with that space, right? And then if you do that, then you can really think about how do we drive that human-centered digital transformation in terms of whether it be creating bespoke solutions that work around how they want to work, or support the nature of work based on how we can let people disconnect and have that flexibility, right? And that's definitely an element that I'm quite passionate about as well. So thank you for addressing that as well. And I really want to thank you again for coming on the show today, Uthpala, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation. And I know you're doing some research around, how do we be mindful about our use of technology, and I really want to support that work that you're doing as well. And if anyone in Australia declares their interest in being part of that study that you're doing, I'd definitely guide them towards that. And thank you again for doing that research, because it's really important aspect of how technology is encroaching into our life. And I think, not just as adults, but also in terms of the future generation. How do we shape the future generation and give them, I guess, good practices, and how they can adapt to using technology in a way that it helps them without affecting their growing minds and having a significant impact later down the road that we don't know is going to be happening, right? And I think that's why I think this, the study you're doing is going to be really important. So thank you for doing that. And I'd love to continue the conversation with you, obviously. Thank you again for coming on the show. If there's anything that you want to share as the closing remarks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Chamara, for having me. And I think one of the things we really need to be mindful about is technology is here to stay, and we are really users of that. So although it can be really, really impactful in terms of our productivity, organizations need to be mindful about the impacts of such constant connectivity to work through technology can have on people. So it is important to think about the individual in this equation and see, okay, how do we get the best out of them? And maybe it is through letting them disconnect from this work environment and bring their best self forward into the workplace the next day.
That's it for today's episode of Transformation 2.0. I hope you found insights that will help you lead change with confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformational stories to leaders like you. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn, and if you have a topic or guest you would love to hear on the show, let us know. See you next time.